This is a rather detailed 3-part fencing series, so to ensure you're making the most of your time, here is what I'll be making. It's a 2 metre high, 26 metre long closed board fence using vertical feather edge pales with both a single and double gate, which I'll be making from scratch. I've never built a fence before, but I'm really pleased with the end result and I'll show you exactly how to achieve the same. And it's a really valuable skill to learn, as when you need a fencer is inevitably after a strong storm, exactly when everyone else is after one too. So I'm going to break this project down into a few sections. The rules around fencing in the UK, a brief look at the site for my fence and the challenges it poses, consideration of the various fencing options and how I decided on a closed board style of fence, installing the posts and rails, building the gates, attaching the feather edge pales and capping rails, and then we'll finish off by looking at the costs, the savings made, and I'll be introducing an experiment I'm doing as well. And amongst all this, there's a mitre saw giveaway, so keep an eye out for that. So thankfully the rules for fencing are pretty simple and quite generous too. You can build up to a height of 2 metres, which does include any trellis you have on top. This drops to a maximum height of 1 metre next to a highway or pavement, which also applies to fences running 90 degrees to the road, but you can just drop the height on the last stretch of fence to 1 metre. The only exceptions are for listed buildings or properties adjacent to listed buildings, where you will need planning. Areas of outstanding natural beauty and conservation areas may have different rules, and in addition, any council can pass Article 4 directions to change permitted development rules, so it's definitely worth checking if any have been passed where you live. Technically, the fence should be entirely on your land rather than straddling the boundary, but any concrete footings below ground level can be over the boundary line. As for which side of the fence faces which way, it's generally the better looking side of the fence which should face outwards towards your neighbour. This is more of an etiquette thing than a hard rule, and we'll look at fencing options in a minute. If your fence has rails of any kind, then you'll likely want them to face inwards anyway, otherwise it makes it very easy to climb over, as well as being good neighbourliness. Fortunately, for my fence, it backs onto woodland, so I don't have the normal neighbour issues, but the boundary is ill-defined. There's an existing chain link fence, but from conversation with neighbours, it seems like that some of the larger trees belong to the woodland, not my garden, or at least they straddle the boundary. To fence between all of them would be very difficult, so for the most part I'm situating my fence outside of the trees. I was lucky in that the chap who manages the woodland for whichever landed gentry owns it came by and approved of the fence, mainly it seems because he liked that I was building it myself. So the challenges with this site are the changes in direction of the fence, the ground slopes at different gradients, and because of the tree roots I don't have full control of where the post will go. It's a trial and error kind of thing, seeing where I can dig a deep enough hole. So here's my thought process on deciding on a closed board style of fence. The first type I looked at were fence panels, which come in 6x6 foot squares, which is 183 centimetres. Add a 15 centimetre gravel board at the bottom and a capping rail to the top, and you've got your 2 metre height. These can be used with concrete or timber slotted posts and gravel boards, with concrete being the more durable option, but more expensive up front. So the advantage of fence panels is that they look almost the same on each side, so no one is stuck with the ugly side. They're pretty cheap, and they go up quickly too. And when they wear out, you can just slide them up and out and put a new one in its place. But in turn, that also means that intruders can lift them up too, unless of course you nail them to the posts. Another, maybe minor issue is that they can rattle in the wind. So I'd say for a straight run on flat ground, they are your best bet. But my site, they just won't work, due to fence panels needing a fixed distance between posts, and because of the slope, I'd end up with a stepped fence, and I'm looking for a more continuous line. So this led me to closed board fencing. I could have the posts as close together as I like, and as much as 3 metres apart, which solves my tree root issue. I could then order oversized pales and cut them to the slope I want, so there'll be no stepping. So the final thing to figure out is the rails between the posts. Now I need to say this right so that YouTube doesn't think I'm using profanity. Cant rails are basically 2x4s with a slant at the top for rainwater to run off. They can be attached to the front of the post, so when the pales are on, you can't see any of the posts. You can also attach them to the back of the post so the posts are visible. Both of these options increase the width of the fence, so you can attach them between the posts, but then you're relying on a couple of screws to hold them. So instead I looked at Arris rails, which, because they're triangular, you can't attach to the front, but you can do so at the back. I didn't really want to see the post though, and the changes of direction in my fence would have meant securing them to the back would have been tricky. So the sensible thing seemed to be to have them between the posts, flush with the front. So how do you attach them securely? The most common method is to use posts with triangular cutouts for the Arris rails, and then screw through into the post, which is nice and sturdy. Unfortunately, because of the changes in angle and the changes in height of my rails, I'd need to alter these V-cuts and then cut new ones on a lot of the posts, so I dismissed this method and decided on using Arris rail brackets. These are generally used for fencing repair because along with the screws they add to the cost and they add to the build time, so tend not to be used by fencers. Neither of these things bother me for a one-time fence build though. The other thing is that they don't look that beautiful, but I'll only be able to see them right at the back of the garden, so that's fine too. They're not the perfect solution as they don't fully mould to the angles, but they're the best option I could come up with. There are of course a myriad of other variations that you can explore, but hopefully this section will get you thinking about how to choose the best style of fencing for your site. I'll mention one last one. If your fence is in a really exposed location subject to high wind, then I reckon something like this is the best solution, which allows the wind to flow through the fence. Okay, let's get building. To prepare the site, I had to cut back some laurel, but I thought it'd be nice to preserve this greenery next to the gate if I can. I'm leaving most of the mesh fence in place, but at the far end I had some metal posts to remove, and long-time subscribers will recognise this breaker. It was definitely a good decision to buy rather than hire. For digging fence post holes, there are two types of tool, the post hole digger and the auger. Which you'll need will depend on the type of ground you're on. For digging holes for my deck in London, which is on clay, I used a digger. But just 20 miles west, I'm now on a band of chalk which runs from East Yorkshire in the north, down to Dorset in the south, and across to Dover. And with chalk comes flint. Lots and lots of flint, so I needed an auger as well to help churn up those stones. Neither tools are expensive, but if you're trying to choose, here's a handy list of what I think will work best depending on soil type. After my side gate debacle with a 3x3 inch post, I chose 4x4 posts for the fence. There are a couple of rules to follow. The first is that a third of the post height above ground should be below ground. So my fence will be 2 meters. Together the counter and capping rails are 7 centimeters, so the posts are 193 centimeters. I can divide this by 3 to get 64 centimeters below ground. I increased this to 75 centimeters with an overall hole depth of around 80 to account for some gravel at the bottom. The other rule is a good diameter for the hole is 3 times the width of the post, so a 4x4 post would require a foot wide hole. I think this is a bit much, especially in firm ground, and the wider you go, the more postcrete you'll need to buy, so there's that to think about too. Once I had all the holes dug, I could calculate the amount of materials and ordered everything from a local company called Country Supplies, and bit by bit carried it all into the garage. I'd ordered 2.7 metre posts, but they delivered 3 metre posts, no problem. I poured around 5 centimeters of gravel at the bottom of each post hole, mainly to help with leveling the post, but also to help with drainage. The end grain at the bottom of the post is most susceptible to soaking up water, so this step is probably more critical in slow draining soil like clay. I've seen it recommended to seal the end of the posts with bitumen, but posts don't really fail because of rot at the bottom, they fail at ground level, which we'll explore in a minute. Now most of my posts aren't in a straight line, but for the few that were, I ran a string line to ensure the holes were in the right position to keep the fence straight, and to help orientate the posts so they face the same direction. The fewer angles I need to cut in the Arris rails, the better. To get the post plumb, i.e. not leaning in either direction, I used 2 stakes pushed into the ground, brought the post into plumb, and then screwed the stakes into the post. I bought this cheap post leveler which gives a good indication of plumb, but for a really accurate measurement, it's best to use the longest spirit level you have. Once I was happy with the position and plumbness of the post, I could pour the Postcrete. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this product. On the one hand, it sets incredibly quickly, within about 10 minutes, which is great, but it's very hard to get the water to Postcrete ratio correct in the hole in the ground where the water is draining away. It doesn't mix that easily, so you need to prod it with a stick, and it's not conducive to being shaped at the top either. Someone commented that you can pour it in dry and the moisture in the ground will set it off, which I'm sure is true, but may take longer, so I followed the instructions on the bags to fill the hole half full of water and then pour the Postcrete on top, but inevitably you have to keep topping up both elements. There are other methods you can use, such as expanding foam, or you could just use normal concrete, which will cost less, it's easier to shape and probably stronger too, but it requires mixing sand and cement and will take quite a while to cure. Another option is metal ground spikes, which I've not tried, they just didn't appeal to me for long-lasting sturdiness. So the top of the Postcrete leaves an uneven finish. This intersection where the post meets the ground level is most critical for a long-lasting fence. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is that the strain put on a fence from a strong wind is all going to be concentrated at this point. The second is that this area is likely to get wet and stay wet for long periods of time. Below ground level this isn't such an issue as the concrete keeps the post dry and there's less oxygen for fungi, which causes rot to grow. So I mixed up some concrete and created a slope away from the post in all 4 directions. Lost Boy commented on my sidegate video that it's worth siliconing around the post as well. I didn't do this, but I think it's an excellent idea, as if the wood contracts in the warmer months, then you can end up with a small gap between the cement and the post which can let water in. If you want to go the extra mile, there are post sleeves you can use in conjunction with a heat gun to help seal them to the post, or you could use bitumen again, but neither look too pretty. Obviously with concrete posts you don't have these issues. With all the posts in, I could cut them to height. With a straight runner fence, you'd usually notch out the top for the counter rail, but because of the changes in direction in my fence, my counter rails will sit on top of the posts, so instead I'm cutting at 193 centimeters above ground level at each post. Behind the counter rails, I don't want water sitting on top of the post, so I cut a 45-degree slope. The next thing I tackled was the gravel board. I briefly contemplated angling them to the slope of the ground, but thought better of it as it would mean cutting the bottom of every single pail to the angle of the gravel board. Having a level gravel board also makes it a lot easier to keep the pails vertical as well, so instead I decided to step my gravel boards at each post. There is an extra step I need to take first though. Bays that are more than 1.8 metres across need a central support in the form of a stump. I bought mine, but you could just as easily cut a 45-degree angle to an Arris rail or any treated timber. I dug a shallow hole in the centre point between the posts, screwed through the bottom of the Arris rail to attach the stump, poured Postcrete, and then I could attach the gravel boards to both the posts and the central stump. I'm using decking screws for this as it will make it easier to replace them in future. The point of gravel boards is to keep the end grain of the pails off the ground. They're 1x6 inch treated boards, which is 15 centimetres, and anyone who has watched this video will know exactly why 15 centimetres is optimal. That's the max height that rain droplets tend to splash back off the ground. Where the fence changes direction, I had to cut the corresponding angle to the gravel board, and to secure them I used angle brackets attached to the post on the back of the gravel board. Arris rails. There are 3 per bay, and I decided on positioning the bottom one 15 centimetres up from the top of the gravel board, the top one 15 centimetres down from the top, and obviously that changes as the posts change height, and one in the middle of the two. Cutting the right angles was tough. A bevel gauge helped, and I did a bit of trial and error. I tried to leave them to a snug fit, so with a bit of hammering they'd stay in position. Because they're triangular, you can't clamp them properly, but once level I secured them with a decking screw into the post. The brackets fit snugly around the rails and have 2 flanges to attach to the post. I use panhead stainless steel screws. The upside of using stainless steel is it doesn't rust. The downside is that it's a softer alloy than metals used in other screws, so it's susceptible to stripping of the screw heads, especially when you're fastening them at an angle. I bought 8 gauge screws in 3/4 inch and 1 1/4 inch lengths. With 6 brackets on each bay, this does take a while, but these rails aren't going anywhere, so good decision I think. Now there are a couple of trees I'm incorporating into the fence. The idea is to fence up to the trees, and then as they grow over time I can use a reciprocating saw to trim back the fence as needed. However, the Arris rails are only attached to one side, and they felt pretty flimsy. If you're doing this on flat ground, the obvious solution is to use the posts with the V-notches and then carry on the Arris rails across the post to the tree. I could have done this on the left side of the tree, but not on the right side, as the Arris rails only come in 3 metre lengths, so I would have had to install another post. On this tree next to the gate, again I couldn't because of a change of angle. So instead, to steady the Arris rails, I put in a stump, this time using an Arris rail cutoff, and then attached more sections between the Arris rails to create a post of sorts, which really solidified these sections. It might seem a bit odd, but all of this will be behind shrubbery, so I won't see it, and it was the best solution I could come up with. This seems like a good place to break up the project. In the second video, I'll be building this single gate, putting in some supersized posts, and building the double gates. I'll see you then.